And before I begin, I just want to throw this question out to you to think about it while we have our first paper by Mr. Jason Lista from the Central Bank of Curaçao and St. Maarten. Um, I just want you to think of it while you're listening to his presentation. Is how many of you here in this room think that tourism cycles significantly affect foreign direct investments? As we listen to Mr. Lisa's presentation and he looks at, the experience of St. Maarten thus far. So can we welcome him?
Thank you for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. Before I begin, let me state the usual disclaimer that the views expressed in the presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the CBCS. Sint Maarten is classified as a small island developing state, or SIDS, by the UN. It has a high degree of trade openness, an intensive and vibrant tourism sector, which generates 70% of its foreign exchange earnings, and is firmly anchored in the constitutional framework of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with strong property rights and an independent judiciary. For several years, Sint Maarten has scored high on regional investment climate rankings. On paper, at least, Sint Maarten should be an attractive destination for foreign investment, yielding a relatively high ratio of FDI to GDP. Yet this hasn't been the case. Compared to its regional peers, Sint Maarten's FDI inflows have been persistently lower, both in nominal terms and as a percentage of GDP, since at least 2011. While Sint Maarten may once have been among the regional leaders in attracting FDI, the data tells a different story. Between 2011 and 2022, Sint Maarten recorded the lowest average FDI to GDP ratio among its tourism-intensive peers, including its Dutch Caribbean sister islands. Tourism dominates Sint Maarten's FDI profile. The largest inflows are in hotels, accommodation, and transportation, mostly from intercompany lending, financial flows between non-resident parent companies and their Sint Maarten subsidiaries or affiliates. Real estate investments by individuals are the smallest category, while corporate real estate FDI is often categorized as either under capital participation or intercompany lending instead. Sint Maarten's FDI inflows were generally positive over the period, but disinvestment episodes do appear, a common feature in small open economies that are vulnerable to shocks. Our FDI inflows are also geographically concentrated. The United States and Switzerland are the leading sources of capital participation. The United States, the Netherlands, and France dominate real estate investments. This pattern mirrors Sint Maarten's tourism source markets and trade linkages, reinforcing the close alignment between the country's external linkages and its investment profile. Between 2011 Q1 and 2017 Q2, before the extreme shocks of Hurricane Irma and the COVID pandemic, the Pearson coefficient between quarterly stayover arrivals and quarterly FDI inflows was approximately 0.2. Beyond that, the pattern is too distorted. This potentially weak but positive relationship doesn't surprise me, as it suggests decoupling, with FDI shifting away from major greenfield investments to more routine maintenance or resilience upgrades. While the coefficient doesn't allow strong statistical inference, it helps support the hypothesis that traditional linear relationships may not capture the structural evolution of FDI in mature tourism economies in small islands. This exploratory finding reinforces the need to examine structural constraints and potential saturation effects through another framework. This paradox, a strong investment climate but low FDI inflows, spurred and motivated the core research question. Why does investment-friendly Sint Maarten consistently record lower FDI to GDP ratios than comparable peers? In reviewing the broad literature on FDI and tourism, and it is broad, two conceptual gaps became apparent. First, many mainstream FDI models, especially panel regressions, focus on determinants and often implicitly assume that FDI behaves elastically in response to traditional macroeconomic determinants such as market size, openness, and institutional quality. This assumption reflects the dynamics of larger capital rich or emerging economies. But in small tourism dependent islands that lack deep and developed capital markets, this elasticity assumption may fail. Second, tourism related studies have typically examined the trajectory of tourism arrivals over time and tourism revenue, with relatively limited explicit integration of FDI as a co evolving structural variable. Yet, drawing from work by Dunning and others, we know that in mature markets, as they saturate, marginal returns decline, infrastructure becomes static or strained, and investors look elsewhere. The market may still be profitable, but no longer seen as expansionary. There is a real world connection. That logic dovetails and aligns closely with Butler's seminal tourism area life cycle, or TALC model, especially its stagnation stage, marked by slowing arrivals, capacity constraints, aging infrastructure, and rising costs. This implicit bridge has been underexplored in the literature, especially for SIDS. A parsimonious hypothesis is one where the simplest explanation, requiring the fewest assumptions, fits the available evidence. Think Occam's razor. It's a principle often used in scientific reasoning to prefer simpler theories over more complex ones when both can explain the same phenomena. Thus, St. Maarten's low FDI inflows likely reflect a structural transition, not just external or cyclical constraints. In other words, it may signal a structural transition in the island's position along the TALC curve. And so the hypothesis is parsimonious. FDI inflows in St. Maarten have mirrored the stages of Butler's TALC, rising rapidly in the early growth phases and tapering as the island reached structural saturation, thereby diminishing further tourism investment opportunities. In other words, FDI slowed not because of weak fundamentals, but because the tourism market itself matured and consolidated. The TALC could offer a structural explanation, especially in a data-sparse environment like St. Maarten, where long macro time series statistics are critically lacking. In this study, cruise tourism was excluded due to its transient nature and limited fixed capital linkages. Stayover tourism better represents the structural evolution of investment in physical infrastructure. This study acknowledges several key limitations. First, the analysis is constrained by the lack of long-term FDI data for St. Maarten, especially before 2010. Reliable quarterly and annual FDI inflow data are available from 2010 onward, but this period captures the latter part of the TALC curve and does not extend far enough backward to empirically trace FDI dynamics during the earlier stages. So it's not possible to construct a full comparative time series trajectory of FDI in parallel with the complete evolution of stayover tourism arrivals. Another limitation is the absence of disaggregated investment types, such as reinvested earnings or project-specific capital formation, for example. These severe data constraints limit the ability to perform reliable econometric analysis with data-heavy models that can tease out causality. So this study therefore interprets the findings with caution. What I use instead is a differential equation to map and determine structural growth and the empirical evidence of saturation of arrivals over the past 35 years. Parameter estimation was done by minimizing the sum of squared errors between the actual and the estimated values. The use of solver in this context is both transparent and replicable, and it is well suited for the limited data availability environments typical of SIDS like St. Maarten. The model needs only 3 parameters: K for carrying capacity, R for the intrinsic growth rate, and T0 for the inflection point. The severe back-to-back shocks to St. Maarten's economy from Hurricane Irma and COVID-19 add further complications when combined with the already limited FDI inflow observations. For this reason, the TALC analysis excludes stayover arrival data from 2017 onward, even though average FDI inflows are taken from 2011 to 2022. Despite these limitations and weaknesses, the applied logistic function fitted to the arrival data provides a credible empirical proxy for structural tourism maturity. Butler's TALC model outlines 6 stages of tourism evolution: exploration, involvement, development, consolidation, stagnation, and post-stagnation, which may lead either to rejuvenation or decline. The model takes the shape of a classic S-curve to model visitor growth over time. While conceptual rather than predictive, the TALC model has become a well-established framework in the literature and has been empirically validated in many tourism destinations. It's the stagnation stage that is of interest here because it signals market saturation. However, the TALC model has been criticized for its simplicity in its basic form. It has also been applied at the national level, while it was initially formulated for a single localized area. Additionally, the model is considered ex post facto, or backward looking, as it identifies a destination stage in the TALC only after it has been reached. Also, determining precisely what carrying capacity is or should be, for example, can be contentious. Nevertheless, the TALC model has been validated empirically in many tourism destinations, including and perhaps especially in some tourism-intensive Caribbean islands. Despite its simplicity and static assumptions, the TALC model remains the most enduring and widely cited framework for understanding the evolution of tourism-intensive destinations. The model can be expressed mathematically using a logistic differential equation, capturing growth constrained by environmental, infrastructural, and spatial limits, characteristics that define many SIDS, certainly St. Maarten. The logistic curve allows us to see not just how much tourism has grown, but whether it has begun to plateau, a key insight of the TALC. It models bounded nonlinear growth rather than unbounded or purely elastic expansion. And I think it is important to pause briefly to understand the different conceptual difference between what a differential equation will model compared to algebraic equations typically used in most econometric regression or panel-based models. Differential equations capture dynamic processes, or how growth evolves over time toward equilibrium or capacity. Most traditional econometric models, by contrast, estimate algebraic relationships between variables that are often linearized or static. Not all, of course, but many. And they require long time series that St. Maarten currently doesn't have. In this context, a different equation may be more appropriate to model constrained growth in a SIDS context compared to the linear or linearized equations found in most econometric approaches that will not be able to capture carrying capacity or, equally important, the inflection point in tourism growth over time. Here, the logistic approach is not about correlation, but about structural evolution, how tourism behaves under real-world constraints. It is not that one is better or the other, but rather choosing the appropriate toolkit for the research purpose. And now, the fitted logistic curve versus actual stayover arrivals. The actual historic arrival pattern closely mirrors the classic TALC S-curve. Early growth, rapid expansion, and then a clear plateau. The outcome of the equation suggests a carrying capacity for St. Maarten of approximately 470,000 stayover arrivals per year, with an early inflection point around 1984. So that was a very fast acceleration. K is based on the best fit in the model. Beyond this threshold, negative externalities may emerge, such as environmental degradation and overuse of infrastructure that begin to outweigh the positive economic gains from additional stayover visitors. Despite the shock from Hurricane Lewis in 1995, you can clearly see it in the curve. The curve captures with remarkable fidelity the underlying structural constraints of St. Maarten's tourism evolution and strongly suggests that from about the mid-1990s onward, There has been a long, prolonged stagnation stage of the TALC, validating Butler's hypothesis. This is the first time that St. Martin's arrivals have been modeled with a logistic function. Over the decades, there has since been a noticeable slowdown in the rate of growth in stayover arrivals, consistent with the TALC's expectations. The logistic growth equation smoothed out the fluctuations in the arrival data and highlighted the deceleration in annual growth as it approached its theoretical carrying capacity of K. Given the obvious correlation between FDI and stayover arrivals in SIDS, St. Martin's stagnation phase suggests a structural ceiling and diminished FDI opportunities. Doing it this way quietly sidesteps the endogeneity issue that's often caught between FDI and tourism arrivals, as it is not regressing one with the other. So is the curve a good fit and depiction of reality? Fit diagnostics suggest that it is a very good fit. Nonlinear curves behave differently, but we can approximate the R squared, which is about 0.8. In other words, the logistic function captured about 80% of the variance in the actual arrivals. This is even more remarkable when we consider the single equation curve that captures 35 years of arrivals and includes the shocks of Hurricane Lewis in 1995 and impact on global travel of the 9/11 attacks. The root mean square error of about 47,000 arrivals is also good given the arrival totals over the decades. The curve depicting structural tourism saturation in St. Martin, combined with its high investment climate scores and paradoxically low FDI to GDP ratios, suggests that conventional linear elasticity based frameworks may not always capture the full evolution in FDI in certain tourism dependent SIDS. Unlike larger economies with deep and developed capital markets, the evolution of tourism infrastructure and related investment flows in SIDS may reflect path-dependent dynamics and the physical constraints imposed by limited geographic size and infrastructural saturation. From a policy perspective, the findings suggest that for tourism-saturated economies like St. Martin, future FDI attraction strategies must account for the country's stage in the tourism life cycle. Policymakers may need to pivot toward facilitating investments that enhance or rejuvenate aging infrastructure, reorient the trajectory of our tourism market upmarket, and promote tourism diversification into complementary sectors such as marine or agritourism. In other words, the old growth model of more and more and more tourism may not hold once you reach such a critical point. This study hopefully reframes the discussion around comparatively low FDI not merely as a failure of policy or competitiveness, but as a structural feature of tourism maturity in specific small island contexts. Recognizing this evolution offers both a diagnostic insight and a foundation for more targeted, context-sensitive strategies for investment and development in the decades to come. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lista, for such an insightful presentation on what is happening in St. Martin. We now invite Ms. Horton from Bank of Jamaica to provide her comments on the paper. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank Jason for such an outstanding application of this classic tourism development model. I find that it contributes to us understanding the modern investment challenge that we notice here in St. Martin. Now, the paper links this stagnation noticed in St. Martin to the observed decline in foreign direct investment inflows. I find that this study is particularly important for small island economies like St. Martin, where tourism is the main engine of growth and a key driver for FDI inflows. So by using the TALC model, the paper provides a conceptual and practical policy lens for understanding why FDI inflows in St. Martin has slowed and how strategic revitalization of the tourism sector could help reverse that trend. I particularly liked that the paper highlights the importance of destination rejuvenation through innovation and higher value tourism, and therefore will stimulate new rounds of investment for St. Maarten in the future. Also, the paper underscores the need to broaden economic base beyond tourism, since dependence on saturated sectors limits long-term growth and external financing. However, while the paper applies the TALC model conceptually and fits this logistic curve perfectly, I'd find that I would recommend a few refinement and future work suggestions. Though there is data limitation, I'd still suggest adding an econometric validation layer. For example, a panel regression linking FDI inflows to tourism arrival, or maturity indicators, or the TALC-driven parameters that Jason highlighted, for example, R or even K. So I'd suggest further regressing the FDI on the estimated stage of tourism, maturity, and controlling for GDP growth, exchange rate stability, and trade openness, thus providing a more causal inference rather than a pattern description. Finally, I'd like to suggest for future work that even though this highlights stagnation in St. Maarten, I'd suggest using a logistic parameter to simulate rejuvenation shocks. For example, what happens to FDI inflows if growth rate R rises by 10% due to digital tourism or even a new airlift capacity in St. Maarten? Now, these counterfactuals I find would translate the TALC results into a more quantitative policy insight rather than observations. Overall, I find that the paper makes a particular innovative contribution by linking the TALC model to FDI dynamics, and Jason presented this insightful and outstanding work very seamlessly, and I'd like to congratulate him for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for such an insightful, review of the paper and comments. I just want to open up the floor first so that you could just take all the questions. Is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a question on this paper? And I just want to remind you of my question I asked initially is how many of you here think that tourism cycles significantly affect FDI in your country, especially service-based economies? I acknowledge Calvin. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Jason. Name's correct. Good morning, Jason. Thank you for your presentation. It's an extremely interesting paper. What I was curious about as you were presenting, some key things that came to my mind. What is the profile of FDI in the tourism sector? For example, how much percent of it is attributed to share capital? How much of it is reinvested earnings, and how much of it is debt-driven? The intercompany loans. That's extremely important because the low FDI to GDP ratio could actually be driven by the fact that the hotels are doing fairly well, meaning that they're not relying so much on working capital loans from the parent company, which would then in turn lead to a tapering of FDI, right? Then the next question that came to my mind, how much of St. Martin's room stock is owned by foreign entities? So I believe there are a couple locally owned hotels on the island. I am not certain, but it would be good to find out how much of the rooms for tourism are owned by foreign entities versus local investors. And then I know FDI is a buzzword, but why just focus on FDI? Because there are other forms of foreign financing beyond FDI. So why limit the paper just to financing from related companies? Why not financing from unaffiliated entities? Because I know quite a few hotels in the island borrow money from the International Financial Institution of the World Bank, and that wouldn't be considered FDI. So if there's, perhaps you can consider broadening the definition for investment beyond FDI. And then the next issue with FDI is the reinvested earnings, which is pretty much just the profits of the recipient entities. So, for example, if the hotels by chance made a loss in a given year, it would be reflected as a decline in FDI in that particular year. And that is something you have to consider in your modeling as well. Because it isn't necessarily that the inflows decreased, it's just that the company wasn't as profitable in a particular year. And that's one of those nuance with FDI statistics that you have to be very cautious with. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. I think there's a bit of nuance that needs to be looked at with this paper. One is FDI, and the focus on this was the FDI is a signal of saturation, not necessarily how the hotels per se are performing. I did mention in the presentation that that kind of granular detail is particularly difficult at this stage. St. Maarten is, it's long-term series and detailed series statistics are a bit of a challenge still in St. Maarten, but we are improving. Second, the room stock is mostly foreign owned, and that you mentioned. What was the other question you said about the capital market? Could you repeat that for me, please?
The point was that FDI is just one form of foreign financing, but there are other channels, portfolio investment, other investments,
Right.
that could be significant for the tourism sector as well.
Well, I think what is important here too is to take into consideration the saturation effects on St. Maarten, and that the paper hopefully tries to realign the growth trajectory and to change the growth model from more and more tourism, more and more volume visitors that may not be, it's more or less like a dead end, and to concentrate on reshaping the tourism landscape. Reshaping it because the infrastructure in St. Maarten is starting to show that you're reaching a saturation point, you're reaching a limit there, and that growth model can't be sustained. That's essentially one of the key takeaways that I was trying to bring about with this paper. And the logistic function is going to show you that you're hitting that structurally, that it's implied in the footfall of the tourism arrivals. That's there structurally, and it's been structurally for decades. I hope that clarifies some of the points that I was trying to make.
So we probably have 1 minute again in this this part of the session. Is there anyone with a question again? No? Okay, so I guess that brings us to the end of Mr. Lista's presentation, and I thank you for such an insightful presentation. I think it offered a fresh perspective on how FDI might lag in destinations like St. Maarten, but it also reminds us that tourism just isn't about visitor numbers, but it's also about infrastructure, the investor confidence, and the vulnerability to shocks. So we thank you, Mr. Lista, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So up